I have been screaming for decades that the Democrats are terrible at messaging. They have yet to develop a simple, compelling message that resonates.
Welcome back to The Unknowns. Today we have Professor Allan Lichtman, who's the author of Keys to the White House. There are 13 different true-false criteria. And Professor, thank you for being here. Before the last election, you were 9 out of 10. Now you're 9 out of 11, but you got to give yourself some grace. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I would say 10 out of 11. I think I got 2,000 right because, as I proved in my report to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Al Gore should have won Florida and the presidency going away, but for the rejection of tens of thousands of ballots cast by African Americans. But we're not litigating.
Yeah, it sounds like you want to debate that. We're not going to get into that. But it sounds like you have a high standard. 9 out of 11 or 10 out of 11 is very impressive. I've looked at the 13 keys. Describe that briefly to the listeners. What are the 13 keys and what are you trying to analyze while you look at a presidential election?
The keys to the White House are different than the pundits. I love them, but they have no scientific basis for prediction and no track record. They're unlike the polls. The polls are snapshots. They're abused as predictors, and they have very large error margins, much larger than the plus and minus 3% they tell you, which is just statistical error. Add on to that non-statistical error. People don't respond. They may lie. They may change their minds, and they don't know who's going to vote, so they have to guess at the likely voters. Unlike all of that, the keys tap into how American presidential elections have really worked. Retrospectively, I went back to 1860. I developed the keys in 1981. And I made my first prediction of Ronald Reagan's reelection in April of 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time, when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again. Get that? And his approval ratings were historically low. So the keys look at how American presidential elections work as votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. And that's what the keys gauge. I can go through them briefly. The mandate key, based on U.S. House elections, incumbency, internal party contests for the incumbent party, third parties, short and long-term economy, policy change, social unrest scandal, foreign/military failures and successes, and only 2 keys have anything to do with the candidates, and they are very high threshold keys, asking whether the candidates of the incumbent and challenging parties are one of those once-in-a-generation, across-the-board inspirational candidates like Franklin Roosevelt on the Democratic side and Ronald Reagan on the Republican side. And the keys are phrased as true-false questions, where an answer of true favors the incumbent party's reelection, an answer of false favors earthquake, that they're bounced out. And the way it works, if 5 or fewer keys go against the White House party, they're predicted winners. 6 or more against them, they're predicted losers. It's totally nonlinear. 6 or more.
It's interesting because it is true, false, and sort of set up as objective answers. It's either true or false. But do you think there is room for bias in that, in the sense that some of them are open to interpretation? For instance, you had predicted, I think, that the economy, short-term and long-term economy, were sound, right? You said yes. But, talk to someone who's paying $7 for butter, they're not going to view that. So how do you determine what is the sort of objective evidence, when you're evaluating the candidate?
The keys are empirical. They were developed over 120 years of politics from 1860 to 1980, and I've answered them since 1982. And while they may seem interpretive, in fact, they are very tightly defined, and I have answered them now for over 160 years of our politics. So you look at the short-term economy, it's very quantitative. It says the economy is not in recession during the election year. You look at the long-term economy key, it says that the real per capita growth during the term at least equals or exceeds the average of the previous 2 terms. Now, if you want to look at, polls and people's perceptions of the economy, go right ahead. Develop your own predictive system. But if you're going to use the keys, you've got to stick to how the keys are defined and how they've been answered for over 160 years of American politics. And of course, none of these critics ever developed their own system.
It must be hard for you. I mean, you have run as a Democrat in the past, and you've had statements as far as how you feel about President-elect Trump. How do you balance that? You're kind of looking at each key, but how do you devoid yourself of just your own feelings to ensure that you are providing an objective viewpoint?
Always checking myself. I'm an historian. I've been an historian for almost 60 years. And as an historian, I have learned to search for truth, to evaluate the evidence, and not let my own political views affect them. If I let myself predict according to my views, I wouldn't be right in 10 out of 11. I'd be useless as a predictor. I'd be wrong half the time. And yes, I'm a registered Democrat, but that's irrelevant. I have predicted the 2 most conservative presidents of our time, Ronald Reagan, and then in 2016, Donald Trump, against all of the conventional wisdom. And you can imagine that these predictions did not make me very popular. 90% Democratic Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. But I did get a letter after my 2016 prediction on the Washington Post, where I predicted Trump's win, and it said, "Congrats, Professor, good call," and signed in big letters, Donald J. Trump. So the very people who were so happy about my predicting Trump in 2016 were all over me this time for predicting Harris in 2024. These are predictions, not endorsements. And I've always said, here is the real answer of how you can be a successful forecaster. You got to know math, but that ain't it. Got to know history, but that ain't it. Got to know politics, but that ain't it. It's keeping your own personal views out of it, which is exactly what I have done in over 40 years.
Just curious, is that letter from Trump stuffed down in some folder, or do you have it on display?
Right in my office over my shoulder here.
I assume Vice President Harris will not be writing you a letter. Who knows? We don't know at this point.
Expect.
So what went wrong? I mean, from an objective standpoint, everything that's successful has anomalies, right? So I'm not suggesting that the keys are flawed, but what, in your opinion, upon reflection, did you not get right?
Yeah. First of all, take all these post-election claims of what Harris should have done or should not have done, and do with them what the great British philosopher David Hume said you should do to works of superstition: consign them to the flames. These off the top of the head post-election claims are worthless. Half the people are saying Harris lost, like Bernie Sanders, she wasn't progressive enough. Others are saying, oh, she lost because she wasn't centrist enough. She didn't move to the center enough, or she didn't say this, so she said that. All worthless. The keys are different because they have a basis for understanding how this election was different. And here's, so far my explanation. I'm still, it's just in a week. I'm still in the process of evaluating, and I have 4 years to do that. But here's what I've come up with so far. The keys are based upon the premise that a pragmatic, rational electorate decides whether the White House party is governed well enough to get another 4 years or not. We have something unique this year that has destroyed that, in my view, and that is an explosion of disinformation. We've always had disinformation, but we've never had it anywhere close to the degree we see this time. Starts with Fox News and other conservative outlets, which constantly disseminate misinformation. Goes to the podcasters with tens of millions of viewers. And then we have something brand new. We have a 300 billionaire putting his thumb on the scales in this election. Elon Musk has a net worth that is greater than the gross domestic product of most of the nations of the world. He controls X, formerly Twitter, and there has been reported, and I believe it, that his disinformation has been viewed by tens of millions of viewers.
You're not implying that he somehow manipulated the vote, correct? This is more about misinformation prior to the election.
Yes. I'm not a technical expert. I have no idea whether the vote was manipulated or not, but there are technical experts who believe it was, but that's not my area of expertise.
Let's put that aside. But what specifically around Elon Musk, what was he propagating that in your mind was sufficient misinformation to mess with the magic of the 13 keys?
Not just Musk, it's all of these other outlets that I've talked about.
Let's talk about Musk, because you seem to target him first.
I can't talk about Musk individually because it's the cumulative effect of all the misinformation. Musk is something new and extraordinary, but it's not him alone. And let me give you examples of the misinformation. Rampant misinformation about the economy. People believing inflation is on the rise. In fact, it's been cut from over 9% to just over 2%. People believing the stock market is tanked. Jobs are going down the drain. Unemployment is at record high. Real wages are collapsing. All of that is false. Or immigration, the other big issue. The misinformation is that these undocumented immigrants are dedicated killers and criminals out to get you. In fact, undocumented immigrants are the most law-abiding segment of our society. Studies by the Cato Institute, not a liberal group, the National Institute of Justice, have documented that crime and violent crime committed by undocumented immigrants is less than half that of native-born Americans. And there's a good reason for that. They do not want to get involved in the criminal justice system. There's misinformation that they're taking jobs away from Americans, draining tax dollars, draining the economy. In fact, they are a mainstay of the economy, contributing large amounts of taxes and the backbone of the agricultural, construction, personal service industry. There's, of course, vast misinformation about hurricane relief, that somehow falsely it's being diverted to migrants. There's vast misinformation about the Ukraine war, that it was started by Ukraine, not Putin, as if a fourth-rate power would deliberately start a war against one of the world's greatest powers. Those are just some examples of the rampant disinformation that is unique to this election and that undermines the fundamental premise of the keys, and moreover, is a severe threat to our democracy. As the great philosopher Hannah Arendt pointed out, once truth dissolves, then democracy follows. It's also lost.
I mean, you're a historian, right? A renowned historian. You certainly know presidential politics, but this isn't the first time that either party has engaged in what some would say dirty tricks. I'm not suggesting what you had mentioned is a cause of dirty tricks, or just getting information out that is more beneficial to their side. So why is this different? I mean, Democrats had access to the internet, podcasts. Democrats had access to MSNBC. They had access to Fox. So I'm curious to know what is different this time.
I started out by saying there's always been disinformation, of course, but nothing close to what we have seen this time. You know, when I was a kid, I read a lot of science fiction, and some of the premises of science fiction was that so few people were becoming so wealthy that they can control society. I thought that was just science fiction, but we're getting close to that. And look what's happened to the mainstream media that could counter this. It's being taken over by the billionaires as well. Look at the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Two of the leading mainstream newspapers are taken over by the billionaires. Plus, it's very, very difficult to counter disinformation. Much easier to put it out than to refute it. There's an old saying, and I believe it: lies travel around the world before truth gets even to put its shoes on. And I've been very critical of the mainstream media, which spends 10 times more time focusing on meaningless polls than telling us what the real consequences of this election are. So there's very little counter to it.
So let's just go back. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but your argument distills down to misinformation around the economy and immigration.
Everything.
Okay,
Everything.
Well, let's just focus here on those two.
Economy,
So, but the economy for many just
foreign policy, and those are just some examples.
I hear you, and it sort of goes back to what I alluded before around short-term economy. I know that you're very scientific, and you looked at it in an unbiased fashion. But for the average American, just going to the grocery store was painful. It still is. So what's the disconnect there? Like, if an American feels like the economy's bad because someone's telling them bad, or do they just simply engage by getting food and realize what I used to pay is a lot more than what I pay, or excuse me, what I used to pay was a lot less than I pay today?
That's just one factor in the economy. And the misinformation focuses on everything, including inflation. The misinformation is that inflation is going up, when in fact, it's been pretty much tamed, under control. The misinformation pertains to every aspect of the economy: jobs, wages, unemployment. People are fed this misinformation, and it all accumulates into the thinking, oh my God, the economy is down in the toilet, when in fact we are the strongest economy in the world. And I guarantee to you, and you can follow this, that all of these things that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are blasting, saying, we're down and going down the drain, they're going to take credit for once they're in power. They can take credit for the same things of the booming Biden economy that they're going to inherit.
So, like, assuming everything you say is true, do you now look at the 13 keys, because we're not putting the genie back in the bottle, and say, the next election, I'm going to add 2 more keys or 3 more keys to account for what, in your opinion, is a shift?
Quite possibly. As I said, I have 4 years. I don't like snap judgment. It's just been a week that I've been able to evaluate this. And absolutely, unlike the pollsters who are trying to squirm out of the fact that they did not forecast what happened in this election, I admit I was wrong. I'm open about that. And I said I was going to reevaluate, but I can't tell you after a week, what I'm going to do. It's going to take time.
Obviously, you had mentioned before some of your past predictions have not gone over well in the Democratic Party. You had mentioned today, or in the last week, you've received death threats. Can you talk a little bit about that, and where is that emanating from?
I've received the most vulgar, scurrilous, violent hate, death threats. The security of my family has been attempted to be breached twice. I've been doxxed. I've been swatted. I'm under police protection. The police have been to my house many times. They've informed the FBI, and I've been doing this for 42 years. And I have never, ever had anything remotely close to this. And I think it's the toxic, violent political atmosphere promoted by Donald Trump. He's constantly evoking violence. Just a couple of examples, talking about guns firing in the face of Liz Cheney, saying, I wouldn't mind if they shot through the reporters to try to get to me. That's, there'll be a bloodbath if I'm not elected. So yes, this is now reflected in what's happened to me. But I'm not important. But this is a very dangerous portent for the future of our democracy. If I'm a target, who else is going to be a target?
That sounds horrendous and horrible, and I hope all the protection for you.
Thank you. It seems to be fading. We'll see.
But is it, it sounds like, where is that emanating from? I assume people, have you had specific things that indicate that to you that these are Trump supporters, non-supporters, Harris supporters? Who's mad at you?
Certainly not Harris supporters. They mimic the same kind of scurrilous, violent claims of Donald Trump. He's called his enemies scum and vermin. He's talked about using the military against his enemies. So this is absolutely consistent, not with anything Harris has said, but everything that Donald Trump has been saying.
Let's move on a little bit to just another topic around, what is going on in the American public? There's been reports of just people indicating that they rejected Vice President Harris because the people who vote for Trump are misogynist, racist. Is that the main reason, or is there something else that people are tired of that would explain his win, not only on the electoral vote, but also on the popular?
I've already given you one explanation, which is the misinformation, and you're absolutely right. The other explosion we've seen here is racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Donald Trump has mimicked Nazi rhetoric, saying immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. They're bringing in bad genes. He has reanimated the worst racial slurs against people of color, that they're dumb, that they're inherently mentally deficient. That was used to justify slavery. That was used to justify Jim Crow discrimination. He has perpetrated the worst myths about immigrants. And xenophobia, racism, misogyny run deep in our society, but they have exploded in this election. America really kind of teeters between two poles. On the one hand, we're a multiracial, multi-ethnic, a multi-religious, tolerant society. On the other hand, we are distrustful of others, whether it's others who are racially different or who are immigrants or who are women. That also runs deep into American society. And unlike any other modern campaign that I've seen, this dark side of American history has come to the fore in this campaign. And I've given you just a few of the many, many examples.
There's some who have dug into the votes and are a bit confused because, in the Bronx, he covered 27%. The Hispanic vote broke for him. So
it didn't break. He did better with the Hispanic.
He did better than previous Republican candidates. Even
Correct.
Illinois, if you add up RFK votes, he got to almost 47%. So yes, and is there some other frustration that can explain how he voted? Not saying it's good frustration or bad frustration. Is there any other reason other than I'm a racist, I'm a misogynist, I'm voting for Trump? How did all of these people come together and decide we're racist and we're misogynistic and we're going to vote? I'm just trying to understand.
I'm not saying they're all racist and misogynist at all. I'm saying that's part of a much bigger picture tied to misinformation. And racism, misogyny, xenophobia crosses racial and ethnic lines. Hispanics and African Americans, no less than whites, are subject to xenophobia, misogyny, and these other factors that I have talked about and discussed. And, the real story of this election is not a boom for Donald Trump. He got about the same votes that he got in 2020. The real story is the fall off of about 10 million votes, Biden votes that didn't vote for Harris. Most of them didn't vote at all. And I think that's deeply tied to the misinformation. These people don't like Trump, but they are subject to the same misinformation on all of these levels that think, oh my God, the Biden administration has driven the nation into the ground. I might not like Trump, but I don't want to vote again for the Democratic administration.
And I know this isn't your wheelhouse per se, but looking at what Harris did in her campaign, were there things that you had wished they had done to address it? What in your mind is this misinformation campaign? Is there something they could have done to counter that and done a better job countering that?
Absolutely. I have been screaming for decades that the Democrats are terrible at messaging. They have yet to develop a simple, compelling message that resonates with the American people. That is endemic to the Democratic Party, at least since Obama won in 2008. Absolutely.
As you look at this and a long expertise in looking at American...
Another thing about the Democrats that I wish they didn't do, and my hands are clean on this because I was a severe critic of this at the time. I was severely critical of the Democrats for openly, viciously trashing their elected president and elected nominee right out in public. I've studied American politics since the founding, and I have never seen anything like that. And I screamed against it at the time, and I think it tainted any Democratic nominee. And I think that also at least on the short term, had an effect on the keys as well. And those same Democrats, haven't looked in the mirror to see what they did. They're blaming everybody else. And again, that's a huge failing on the Democratic Party. They need a reckoning, and they're not doing it.
I mean, clearly, your keys have never sort of had to deal with a president, and I'm not blaming him if he had a medical condition or if he was in need of either through dementia, whatever was going on with the president. We saw that sort of in that first debate with Donald Trump. If you had a column for keys, is there perception that the president is cogent and sentient all the time? Would that have changed things for you?
I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to medically diagnose Biden, but I have summarized American politics in one sentence. Republicans have no principles. Democrats have no spine. There are at least as many indications of a decline in Donald Trump as there were in Joe Biden. He confused Nikki Haley and Nancy Pelosi. He was out gibberish about the late, great Hannibal Lecter. He spews out gibberish about, do you want to be killed by electrocution or a shark? He couldn't name his doctor. He forgets what city he's in. He barely could make it up the stairs of a plane. Do Republicans care one whit? No, not a word from Republicans whatsoever about all this evidence of the decline in Donald Trump. But one bad debate, and the spineless Democrats are all over their president.
So in your mind, as you look back, would you have preferred President Biden staying in the race and not having that switch?
Who knows? I don't know what would have happened if Joe Biden had stayed in the race, but I do know the Democrats handled the situation with Biden as badly as you possibly could and still aren't facing up to what they did.